Okay, so when we were talking yesterday, I didn't get through all of the syllabus, and I didn't get to your assignments, and that is the most important thing we need to cover today, is to make sure that you're prepared. First off, your first assignment will be to take a quiz on Friday. It will be set up so you can take it anytime between 7 in the morning and 7 at night. It will be timed. Somebody asked that question earlier. It will be timed so that you have no more than 1 minute per question, and depending on the questions, if they're true and false, it might be only a half a minute. If it's multiple choice, it might go to a minute. So you're not going to be able to look up all the answers at the time. You have to do some study ahead of time, and yet even a minute is quite a bit of time if you kind of know where to go. If you may not be able to remember exactly, but you might be able to find you know where it came from. In this case, the quiz is going to be totally based on my lectures and on Chapter 1 of my crash course book. And we will review that today in class. But it is also posted now on our Moodle site, so you can read Chapter 1. It's not too long. I can't remember exactly how long, a dozen pages or so. So you can refer to the printed portion. You can listen to me and take notes, whatever, but our quiz will be based on my lecture and on primarily on Chapter 1 of the crash course. I guess I'll go ahead and put this into the presentation mode. Maybe slightly better. And bring this down here. Okay. So we talked about some of this stuff. I need to now go forward real quick. I didn't mean to start right there. We talked about some of these elements. I want to review those quickly because we didn't really have time to talk very much about them yesterday. So I want to go in a little bit more detail. I did mention before that, let's go back just a second, make sure I'm turning this for, okay, let's cover this page first. Okay, we talked about yesterday about where you come up with stories, because your assignment that will be due next week will be coming up with 3 story ideas and coming up with ideas for sources, also create some questions for them, and I'll demonstrate that in today's tutorial, what I expect from you next week. But again, story ideas, if you did not happen to attend class yesterday, the lecture, video version of the lecture is on Moodle. You need to sign up for Moodle. And the code word, as I explained yesterday, or the password, whatever, is NE 2018. So that's what you'll need in order to sign up for the class. We reviewed yesterday quickly how to get to this point, but you need to self-enroll with the keyword or password NE 2018. If you need some help, probably your other people in the class can help you, or I can help you get to that point where you need to enroll. Okay, going back forward again. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's lots of valuable places where you can find story ideas. I mentioned that one place is other publications. You're not because you're plagiarizing. You definitely don't want to plagiarize. You'll get a 0 for that. But because they just give you an idea. That idea, it could be that you could look online for other student newspapers, for example. That's in essence what we're producing this semester. We will be producing a student newspaper. That's one reason why you're writing stories, so we have real content. So we will be presenting or preparing a student newspaper. So we want you to find real stories. You can look at other student newspapers for ideas. You can, the stories should as I mentioned yesterday, be relevant to our students. But that doesn't mean they have to be directly about Xiamen University. They could be an international story about something going on in China. A good percentage of our students are from China. Therefore, a story about China is relevant, or could be anyway relevant, if it's not too obscure. If it has importance to our Chinese students, then may not be relevant to everybody, but no newspaper carries stories that every story is relevant to everybody. No newspaper does that. And so, as long as your story is relevant to a large proportion of our students at Xiamen, then it's relevant. Of course, the more relevant it is, the more interesting it is, the better grade you'll get. The quality of your idea is about as, maybe not as important, but it is definitely part of your grade. In other words, when I read it, am I interested in it? As an editor, that's one thing I ask myself. Is this interesting to me? Because if it's not interesting to me, I have to presume it's not interesting to my readers. And so if somebody brings me a story that is ho-hum, boring, it will not get in the newspaper, and therefore it should not get a good grade. So you want an interesting story. We mentioned different ways of getting that, but one thing I would emphasize is when you have a good story idea, write it down. Write it down. Ideas, whether you're a journalistic writer, an academic writer, a novelist, anything like that, ideas are worth a lot of money. And if you don't write your ideas down, then they may evaporate. You may not have them a day later. You may forget what you wrote down. Or what you didn't write down. So write down your ideas, whether in this class or later as a professional. Don't lose your good ideas. They're important to you. They're valuable to you. Also, I mentioned yesterday that good people, in essence, are good ideas. If you have good sources and those people are themselves newsworthy, then just setting up an interview with somebody, you're presuming that if you spend enough time with them, they will give you a good idea. So if you set up a interview with the mayor of a city, you're presuming that somewhere in there you'll be able to ask a question that will prompt them to tell you something interesting. In fact, your question might very much relate to that. What's going on in the city of interest that nobody's talking about? That might get him thinking about what other reporters have not asked him, for example. So, people automatically lead to good ideas if they're interesting people or newsworthy people, and other sources can give you ideas. You might not do it exactly. In fact, you should not do it exactly the same. If you get an idea out of a publication, out of a student newspaper or whatever, you're not trying to plagiarize. You're just trying to get ideas. That's what the point of looking at other publications is, to get ideas. Okay. Let's move on to, we talked, a second. Can't hear. Uh-huh. Well, I just got it working. It is working now, but the mechanism that launches it was not working quite right, and I figured out how to make it work right. So I do have the projector now. The projector is working, but it wasn't initially. No, I have it working now. I'm okay now. Yeah, the card reader is loose. It's not real tight, and so I had to adjust the card in such a way so it could read my card. Yes. Yeah, now okay. Thank you. Bye. Sorry. Okay. So, We were talking about news values, and I told you, emphasized yesterday, that consequence and curiosity are the most important. Let me turn to actually the book. This is all, we want to make sure that we're covering everything that's in the textbook in this first chapter, at least the key points. That doesn't relieve you of reading it. You'll understand it better if you read it. But why is it? No, my mouse isn't working here. I may have to stop it here in order to get it to go where I want it to go. Okay, so this is chapter 1 from the crash course. Again, the whole all 4 chapters that we're going to be reviewing this semester are on Moodle. Again, part of this has already been covered, so let's go on down and again talk about the news values. We talked a little bit about timeliness. In this class, timelessness is more important. Pay attention to this. It's very important to you to get a good grade. You need timelessness in your stories. A news value is, when possible, you want it to be as timely as possible. You want it to be as current as possible. That's the general rule in news. News is news because it's new. That's the general rule. But in our case, and in some other cases with a magazine and with my weekly newspapers, when I was competing against daily papers, then it was important to be timeless, not timely. So as I mentioned the other day, I would go to a city council meeting. Other reporters that I was competing against would write about the event. I would write about key issues. And my issues, therefore, when I was interviewing people later, the mayor, the city councilman and stuff, I would not say when I interviewed them. I was covering the issue, not the event. Now, I might mention the event in the story. Let's say in the story they voted to raise taxes, was my example the other day. I might mention that they voted to raise taxes, and therefore, in that sense, I refer to an event in the past. But then my story is primarily about what the sources have to say about it now as an issue. So I'm not quoting them as speaking in that during that event. I'm quoting them as now discussing the issue. Magazines, very frequently, the stories you read in a magazine will be 6 months old. So the last thing they want to do is tell you when they did that interview. They do not want to tell you that. Therefore, they will not tell you that, and instead they use present tense, very frequently use present tense attribution verbs. So they say says, or something like that. They use present tense attribution rather than, because it kind of sounds like once you say said, once you go to past tense, the feeling of the reader is you have to tell them when they said it. There's a sense that you have to give a when to it. But if you use present tense attribution, now you can ignore the when element of your interview. Particularly, you ignore the when element. So when I was competing against the daily papers, that's what I would do. They would have past tense verbs about the event. I would have present tense attribution verbs about the issues, not about the event. And then I would expand. I could expand. I didn't have to only quote what they said in the meeting. I could then do follow-up interviews and expand it and get information that the other news media did not have. And so my stories were always better than their stories. I knew what they wrote the next day. Mine would always be better because I then would take it from there and go beyond that. In our case here, we're kind of more like a magazine because we will come out with 3 editions, by the way, and they will be posted on our Facebook site or wherever else our department chairman thinks I should post them. I'm not sure. But we will have 3 publications after you get done writing your stories. One publication will be in magazine format. A magazine, we're going to presume that our magazine is more or less this size. Not all magazines are this size, but for our purposes, we're going to say this size. A tabloid, then the second edition, second publication we'll create will be a tabloid. A tabloid is basically twice the size of this booklet. So if you can imagine, a lot of newspapers are tabloid size here in Malaysia. In America, not so much. They are broadsheet, typically, especially daily papers. Well, broadsheet is double this size. So if you can imagine double that size, up here, that then is broadsheet. So they are actually portions of each other. You have a magazine can be about 1/4 the size of a broadsheet, and a tabloid is 1/2 the size of a broadsheet. Broadsheet being the largest size, something like that. So we're going to do one of each, because that allows you then to set up different experience setting up different publications within Quark Express that we're going to be using to do it. And so we'll start off with a magazine style, then go to tabloid style, then go to broadsheet style. And the design principles vary a little bit from each. For example, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but just real quickly, in a broadsheet like this, you have plenty of room to have a really big photo to catch people's attention, and then you can easily create a golden triangle. So I mentioned yesterday, you have a big picture maybe upper left, you have a smaller picture middle right, and a picture that could be a little about the same or a little bigger in the lower left. So first off, the big picture, you want it to be really good, and so it captures people's attention. They go into your big picture at the upper left, then there's a photo on the right, so their eyes wander over to the right, then there's a picture to the left, at the lower left, and their eyes wander back to the lower left, and in doing that triangle, their eyes have passed through all 4 quadrants of your page. You can do that, definitely do that with a broadsheet. You can still do that with a tabloid. You can't do that with a magazine. You can't do it effectively with a magazine. It's too small. So a magazine has to be formatted differently. You still want something to capture people's attention. A magazine article, almost by its nature, will be multi-page. So your first page probably has a big piece of art to get people's attention, and then you have smaller pieces of art on pages 2 and 3. Your magazine project will be 3 to 4 pages long, jumping from one page to the next. So each one of those creates different challenges to you. By the way, in writing your story, one of your requirements is to figure out art, whether photographic art or other graphic art. You need to get full credit, you need some art with your story. So that's also part of what you're going to what you're going to propose when you create your list of story ideas, is what kind of art will you have with your story. Okay, going down then. So timeliness is important, especially if you're a daily paper. Not so important if you're competing against daily papers. Now you want, as I said, timelessness, possibly, and that's what we're looking for, because the magazine will come out somewhere around the, maybe a third of the way through, maybe a little more than that, maybe about halfway through the course, we'll put out our first publication, which will be a magazine. Then about 3 weeks later, or something like that, about 3 or 4 weeks later, we'll put out our tabloid, and by the last week, we'll put out our broadsheet. So we're going to put out 4 different publications, and each one will be posted for our students at Xiamen University to read. So do a good job. Don't make your sales look stupid. Make sure you're accurate. And while this should put some incentive on you to do a good job with your first project, major project, which is write your story. Okay, so timeliness is important, but not always. In our case, timelessness is more important. We talked about proximity a little bit already, and we talked about how proximity is sometimes not just geographic proximity, but cultural proximity. It really, as I mentioned, my number one news value is consequence. And this really relates a lot to both timeliness to some degree, but definitely to proximity. Something closer to you is more likely to have consequences to you than something far away. Therefore, we get back to the idea that I gave yesterday, how many Africans will have to die to get a story about 5 local people dying off the front page to replace it. It may be quite a few because, especially in America is kind of ignorant of the world, kind of very self-centered, and so a lot of them don't really care what's happening in Africa. And so it might take 10,000 Africans to die before they can boot off a story from the front page about 5 local people dying in an accident or something. Certainly it'll depend on the other elements of the story, but proximity has to do with consequence always. So it's, let's go down. Going too far now. We talked about pathos. Basically, pathos is something that tugs at your heart. If you can get people to feel something, that gives it news value. So that is more frequently something you can achieve with a feature story. Our stories that we'll be writing in this class are somewhere between a news and feature story. So the more feature-ish your story gets, and that's okay, it can be feature, the more likely you could find a story that might tug at people's hearts. But that certainly has news value even with a news story. If you can find a pathos angle, that's good. Same with humor. Humor is more likely to go viral than just about anything. So if you can find a good humor story, not only will it be popular with your readers and your subscribers, but you put it online, it could go viral if it's interesting enough, humorous enough. Love is close to pathos, and of course people can have those tender feelings towards not just romantic stories, but also feel love towards children, animals, so forth. So love is a news element. Achievement is valuable, especially, we get back to the idea of consequence. We feel that a story about achievement is more important if it's somebody that we relate to, and that particularly also relates to proximity. If somebody from Xiamen University does something amazing, that's news to us. If somebody at Harvard University does the same thing, that's not news to us. We don't feel that we kind of share in the achievement if they're from our university, or from our city, or from our country. In the Olympics, it's our country. Even more so if it's from our city. But we're looking for something that, for achievement to be the most important stories about achievement, somehow we think they relate to us. It's our country showing us proud. It's whatever. So achievement does have it's considered a news element by itself, but it does also relate to consequence and so forth, and proximity. So these news values overlap quite a bit. Suspense, this could be something more like a crime story. There might be other conflicts, conflict of survival. Somebody gets falls off a ship at sea, and they're out there for weeks, and they survive. You can build a story of suspense around that. If you're going to build it with suspense, you're not going to use your standard inverted pyramid. Because if you use your standard inverted pyramid, you're giving away the punchline. So there's no suspense anymore. They survived. So that also affects how you write a story. Not all stories are written in inverted pyramid. I'd say, for lack of a good reason to do otherwise, I want you to use inverted pyramid. But there are reasons why sometimes you don't. Suspense is one of those reasons. You don't want to give the punchline before you're done. That may also be true with humor. You may tease people in the lead and give the punchline towards the end if it's a humorous story. Curiosity, basically that's what news is all about overall, is that we are curious animals. We want to know what's going on, and news reporters are among the most curious of all human animals. That's why they become journalists, is that they want to find out first. They want to be the first one to know who's been elected as president. They want to be the first one to know who won that sports event. They want to be the first one to know the inside scoop on a famous entertainer or whatever, and have access to them. In my life, for example, I spent an hour with Bill Clinton without any other reporters, one-on-one. I basically, my position of the newspaper gave me that opportunity. So before he was president, he was governor of Arkansas, and I was the editor and publisher of a newspaper and had that opportunity. So you have, with being a journalist, you have opportunities of doing things you would not have otherwise, and that's one reason why you are a journalist, because you want to know first, you're curious. And so you share that curiosity with other people. But ultimately, as I said at the very top, I put consequence, a story that, well, we've talked in other classes that you may have been in. I've asked the question of so what? So what? I ask it in teaching. If I'm teaching you something, I ask myself, so what? Why should I teach you this? Why is it important for your future? So I ask myself the so what question frequently. But as a journalist, I always have to ask that. Especially as an editor, I must ask myself that question all the time. So what? This news story that has no so what element has no consequence, has no place in a news medium. So it has to have that so what element. It has to have consequence of some sort. It has to be, you have to give the readers a reason to read, the viewers a reason to view. If you don't have that, then you don't have a story. And if you fill your paper up with stuff that is ho-hum that most people don't want to read, you don't have a news medium. It goes broke. I mentioned, I think yesterday and in other classes, that what you are selling is people's attention. And so if you don't write well, if you don't write interesting stories, if you don't write stories of consequence, nobody's going to read them. Therefore, they're not going to read the ads on the same page. You know, if there's that's in a newspaper or a magazine, that's what they do. They get you onto a page and they want you to read the ad that's next to the story. If nobody's reading the story, nobody's reading the ad. I can guarantee it. And I mentioned the other day how that first newspaper I worked for ultimately went broke because, I guess I didn't explain the rest of the story. Come to think about it. But ultimately, I ended up leaving that newspaper because they decided that I was too controversial. And a couple of friends of the general manager convinced him that we should be less controversial. But I knew that my controversial stories were getting readers. And without controversial stories, we would have no readers. We were the new publication. As I mentioned, you know, the publisher really hurt himself by lying about how many papers he was going to produce, and he couldn't get them all out. And even if he had, when you're first putting out a free newspaper, nobody has a habit of reading your newspaper. Therefore, you have nobody's attention to sell to advertisers. The first couple of weeks, your advertising is worthless, pretty much worthless. You might as well just give it away free. Because nobody's yet, especially if it's a free publication, you have no evidence that anybody's reading it, and probably because they're not. They have not yet, unless you have done a great marketing job yourselves and convinced people they need to read your publication, then the first time you put it out, if you think it's going to promote itself, well, the first week is not going to be adequate. Nobody's going to read it. It's going to take you a while to build up that readership. And if you have boring stories, nobody's going to read it. So basically, what the general manager's friends were telling him, you should have boring stories because you're upsetting some people by being controversial. And so I was not mad. I said, that's fine. You're the boss. You can do what you want to do, but I'm leaving. I'm not going to stay here for your suicide mission. Because if you do not have readers, you're going to be destroyed. And that is what happened. I left. I bought my own newspaper then, and they ended up having to sell their newspaper fairly quickly. In fact, before they sold their newspaper, they tried to regain people's attention. But it's kind of the same problem that the publisher had in lying to the advertisers. Once you burn somebody, now getting them back is really hard. And so after just a couple of months, they realized they had lost all their readers after I left. And they had replaced me with a very good editor, but he was doing what the boss told him to do, and he was writing basically boring stories. And so I called him up a couple of months later and asked him how it was going, and he said, the boss basically realized you were right, and so we're now going from broadsheet to tabloid, and we're going to have tabloid-type contents. We're going to be as controversial as we can get to get our readers back again. And yet they failed, and they had to sell out. So you have to answer that question of so what? You have to give people a reason to read your story, or you have no publication, no news medium at all. So you can argue about all the rest of them, but the first one, don't even try to argue. Consequence is the most important thing, the most important news element. Nothing else would top that. I said the curiosity is my second one. After that, I might entertain arguments. We talked about the 5 W's. You know what the 5 W's are: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. I've mentioned already that the why and how are the most important, partly because they provide those elements I was just talking about. The why and how get to the consequence. They also, the how particularly, may get to the suspense and to the curiosity, to all those other things, the suspense, the curiosity. The how element can get to elements that make your story more interesting. And among other things, they can also, one of the questions will be, well, how does this impact our citizens? Well, that is then becomes a question of consequence. So how is an important question for getting to consequence, as well as why something's happening, why are you doing this? You start delving into the issues, why something happened. Oops. All right, somebody should tell me. I'm showing you stuff on the screen that they're not showing up there. Okay, so what did I do? What I need to do? I need to and my mouse doesn't seem to be working. Okay, I'm going to steal this other mouse. Okay, let me try that again. Okay, well, that's what I was trying to show you, and I wasn't aware that I wasn't. Sorry. Okay, so back here, we are going through chapter 1, and even though you could not see it, sorry. So anyway, why did you do such and such? How did this occur? Describe it to me. Why and how questions. With all the questions, it's not just one question. There's lots of questions you can ask, starting with that one word: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So you want to delve. You want to ask and ask and ask till you get what you need, whether it be again, the consequence element that you're pursuing. You may have to ask a lot of questions to get there. Or if you're going for the, for detailed to create a suspense story or a curiosity story or something like that. To get those sorts of details, you need to ask lots of questions. A lot of those may be how, a lot of those may be why. There is, along that line, and it also relates to the idea of borrowing story ideas from a newspaper. Have any of you ever heard of the book or movie called In Cold Blood by Truman Capote? Probably not. Anyway, Truman Capote took a story that was only about this long in a newspaper, maybe in inches, maybe 6 inches long, and he turned that into a book of about 900 pages, a very long book. He did a lot of in-depth interviews. Basically the story was about a murder of a family, a farm family out in the middle of Kansas someplace. And he was able to gain access to the murderer and got him to open up. He wasn't talking to anybody else, but through his persuasive questions, and I don't know exactly how he got him to open up, but he got him to open up and give him the details of what he did, why he did it, what he was feeling, so he could kind of judge his psychosis. He did in-depth interviews with people who knew the family, and in his case, you might call it new journalism. He used some artistic license to make it sound more like a story, like a build up the suspense and all that. Even though you knew this family was going to die, you still told the story from start to finish in great detail, and in some cases he like I said, used artistic license to create conversations and stuff that he had no way of knowing. But the point is, he started off with a 6-inch or 7-inch news story, and he wrote 100 times that much in his book that won major prizes and became a movie and so forth. Very frequently you can find an idea somebody else, like a daily newspaper writer, has written a few inches on and do better than that. I mentioned, for example, a fire story that was maybe 5 inches in the daily newspaper. That's one I would kick out in an hour or less. I would read what the daily newspaper had to say. I'd call up the fire chief. Are all the facts in the Tribune's story accurate? They'd say, yes, it's all accurate. Therefore, I could say it myself, that they told me that these things were true. Once I did that, then I could start pursuing the unanswered questions that they did not answer. Like, how did it happen? As I mentioned the other day, why did it take so long for the fire trucks to get there to put out the fire? Whatever it might be. That 1-inch, that 5-inch story became, for me, maybe a 12-inch story, and emphasized something totally different that had more of a consequence angle to it, and had, was emphasizing, or maybe I did this many times, so I don't remember this precise story, but it might have a suspense element to it, something, give it a different twist than just a fire broke out at a so-and-so location. That they would write, mine took a different angle and made it more interesting. Okay. We have talked about before, if you were in any of my other classes and did any news writing in those classes, that I want lots of attribution. I am very disappointed in the quality of journalism in America right now, because they're either not attributing or they're making very, very vague attribution on a lot of stories. Especially right now, they're trying to destroy the president. Whether you like Trump or not, their journalism is not very good. Even the New York Times has published stories that later on the FBI had to say were false. They're depending on unnamed sources, and they are not verifying those sources, and they're getting away with basically slander. In America, that's okay. You can't. First off, their slander and libel are not criminal acts in America. They are civil acts, And so you could be sued for them, but the president couldn't sue anybody. The more famous you are, the less access you have to remedy if somebody lies about you. And so they're taking big pot shots at the president without good backing, without good sourcing, without clear attribution, without specific attribution in most cases, and that is really crummy journalism. That's not to say sometimes it's not necessary. Watergate depended on anonymous sources just inside times, but then they would go find real sources as best they could, and they built up from there. In their case, their editors made sure they had multiple sources. They would not depend on one anonymous source, for example. A lot of these stories coming out right now are anonymous and like one source stories. People who know they can't be hurt because the reporter has promised to keep their name secret, and so they basically lie to the reporters. And even, like I say, the FBI has verified that a lot of the stories coming out in the newspapers are just plain false. So I'm not real pleased with current journalistic practices. In my day and age, everything was to be attributed and as specific as possible. You had to have a very good reason to go with an anonymous source. And then it got to where, because some journalists cheated and made up sources, then the next practice was you cannot be the only person that knows the source. An editor also has to know your source. You can't, because, as I said, one Pulitzer Prize winner, that's the highest prize in journalism in America. I still have a copy of a story about a reporter for the Washington Post, one of the top newspapers in America, who won the Pulitzer Prize, and then Associated Press figured out that she was a liar. And once they figured out she was lying on her CV and other stuff, then the editors had to take her in and kind of grill her, and they found out that her sources were all made up, that her stories were all fictitious, basically. And was very, very embarrassing. I think it also happened to the New York Times about that same period of time. And so during 2 decades ago or so, you could not have anonymous sources that were also known by your editor, because your editors, they had, like I said, been burned in very, very big, high-profile, famous cases where their reporters lied. And so that doesn't seem to be the case now. They seem to be using a lot of anonymous sources without any backup, without any verification. Part of your effort to make your story more believable, more credible, is to have direct quotes. And those direct quotes also give personality. They give emotion that you yourself in your own writing probably cannot quite share, but you can let people feel emotion through somebody's quote. They can say things that you can't say as a journalist. And so a direct quote can bring a lot of power to it, a lot of human interest, a lot of emotion, so forth. So you want direct quotes to humanize your story by my way of writing anyway, and my way is getting graded in this class, so that's important. And it has always done very well by me. I've always gotten high praise for my writing. But that still might be probably no more than 40% of your story would be direct quote. And that would be the most. I put in here, you see up here, it says 20 to 40%. 20, I think, is in the lower end of the stories that I would write, would be 20% direct quote. Some writers don't use very much direct quote, and I disagree with their style. I think that's a bad choice. I think direct quote is very, like I say, very important for to relay credibility and emotion and other elements that personalize and humanize your story. So that's what I recommend highly. However, that's direct quotes. The rest of it is basically paraphrase and indirect quotes. I don't want to encourage you to do anything except pretty much everything should have should be attributed to somebody else. You have no opinion. That's how you can be fair, how you at least sound fair, and that is Western-style journalism. And I have to confess that in my PR classes, my public relations classes, I tell them to attribute essentially everything. And I do it in their case to help them fool people, so to speak. If you're going to try to convince people that they should trust you, you should still sound like a journalist. And so if you're really a PR person, well, you're trying to, you're trying to pretend that you're a journalist. Even though you will bias your story in your writing, undoubtedly, because you have a point to make, but you're trying to achieve something through your writing. So your version of the story may be well written, may be good, but it will probably be biased, and but that doesn't mean it can't have direct quotes. In fact, I even recommend, if it's a controversial subject you're writing about, quote the other side. One of the most powerful forms of PR is called the inoculation theory of propaganda. Inoculation is what you get to not get the flu. They give you a shot, give you inoculation to keep you from getting the flu. And what is an inoculation? Basically, inoculation is a bunch of dead germs. They put into your body dead germs that your body will then build antibodies to fight against. And so when the real germs show up, you don't get sick because your body already has developed antibodies to that DNA, even though it was those germs that they put injected into you were dead already. So in essence, PR people can do the same thing. They can give people a very weak dose of the other side, a very strong dose of their side, and they subsequently, their readers, if they can get to the readers with their version of the story, their hope is they'll believe their side because they've made it more powerful, and yet they think they understand the other side. But they don't understand it very well because the other side is being represented by you. You're the one, or you're taking a quote from the other side, say a political candidate, you may be quoting the political candidate, but you're not choosing his best quote. You're choosing a bad quote, or a quote that makes him sound like an idiot, or a person that makes him sound like whatever. Truthfully, a lot of the journalists are basically using the inoculation theory of propaganda in the way they're writing about Donald Trump right now. They're giving a very weak dose of his side and a very strong dose of another side. And so that's, again, why I am very upset with the current state of journalism in America and some other Western countries. Nonetheless, if you want to be a good PR person, you should pretend to be a good journalist, even though you're not. In some cases, however, you can actually be a good journalist and be a good PR person in the sense that I got a front page story for an engineering firm. It's hard to get a front page story for an engineering firm, but I got a front page story from them because one of their areas of expertise was environmental engineering. And somebody had sent a letter to a lot of public officials in Washington, D.C. With germs in the envelope. With, what was it? I'm forgetting now what they were trying to infect them with. It was, I forget. Anyway, they were trying to infect people with a deadly disease. By putting that disease, by putting some of the germs of that disease in some envelopes, mailing it to Congress people and other people in Washington, D.C. So my engineering firm was 4,000 miles away in Washington State, a long ways from Washington, D.C., but they were so desperate for getting good environmental engineers that they hired our firm to be one of the firms to go to Washington, D.C. and clean up, to go test all of the buildings that this terrorist might have sent these envelopes to, these letters to, and make sure that there were no germs in those facilities. If they found them, they had to put on all their gear to protect themselves. They had to do that before they tested, obviously, and totally clean out those facilities that were contaminated by these germs. Well, even though we were an engineering firm, I recognize this is a good news story. So I was able to write that story very upfront, very new, very journalistically, and it got on the front page of a major daily newspaper and was covered also by the TV as a lead story. So if you can think like a journalist, you can be a good PR person. And in some cases, yes, you may kind of twist, spin the story a little bit. Other cases, you're doing true journalism, but it's about your company or your organization. You definitely want to be accurate. Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. However, the truth is nobody's totally accurate unless they actually transcribe a recorded, they record and transcribe all of their interviews. They're not going to be exactly accurate. And so don't get too hung up on it. If you've been in a class of mine, what my rule of thumb is, you are accurate enough that the source doesn't know that if you're wrong. So if the essence is true, sometimes, for example, I marry quotes. Anybody know what a marrying quotes is? What you do when you marry quotes? That is, you're taking notes and you don't get a complete quote, so you have like a half a quote here, and then you keep keeping notes and you get another half a quote someplace else, but the two kind of come together okay. So you marry one half quote to another half quote and you have a whole quote, but they really weren't said together. But they fit together, and you can marry quotes sometimes in such a way that that the source won't care, and the essence is not at all. The essence of the quote is accurate. You're just taking a piece here and a piece there, and they're both pretty accurate half quotes, and you marry them together and make one whole quote. Again, you want to make sure that they reflect what the person was trying to say. You don't want to marry quotes and make it inaccurate or not truly representative of what they're trying to say. But and you might put a ... an ellipsis between the two half quotes if you feel like you need to. But if you're the only reporter covering that story and you don't think it misrepresents what the person was saying, then you don't bother. Go ahead and put it in. I mentioned in other classes that you purposely change quotes sometimes to correct their grammar. You don't want to put quotes in that have bad grammar. And so you will correct a source's grammar unless you're really trying to make them look stupid. Sometimes the liberal press did that to George W. Bush. They'd go ahead and make him sound stupid. So they go ahead and quote him exactly. They would go ahead and correct the grammar of other people, but they would let him use his bad grammar, and they quote him directly just to make him sound stupid. Typically, though, we don't want to do that. And you probably should never do it for that purpose. That's a bad purpose, is to bias your stories by quoting somebody so accurately that you make them sound stupid. You want to get to the essence of what they're saying, so typically you clean up their grammar and you don't apologize for it. You're doing them a favor. So in other classes I've mentioned that I sometimes use a recorder. Ironically, in my entire career of decades long, it's kind of split up. Sometimes I went into teaching and came back, or marketing and came back. But over a career of 40 years, nobody has ever accused me of being inaccurate where I was actually, how do I say this? Let me put it this way, the only people who have ever accused me of being inaccurate have accused me of being inaccurate because I was accurate. That's why because I embarrassed them by being accurate. In two cases, I had recordings that I could say, come to the newspaper, listen to the interview, the mayor is lying. Okay. In fact, both cases where I had recordings, they were both mayors of a city. And they both were, lost their positions because they tried to lie about and claimed that I was distorting what they said, and I wasn't. I had recordings to prove it. So that's kind of a stupid thing to do if you know that somebody's running a recording of your interview. I did that those 2 times. It was before the internet. Another public official did the same thing, and I put her interview on the internet and invited everybody to listen to her entire interview on the internet, that she was lying. Let them know that that public official was outright lying and gave them easy access on the internet. The only other person who ever accused me of being inaccurate was also lying, but I didn't have a recording of her, but hers was actually a little bit funnier. She was embarrassed by what she said. This was in the first paper I bought that I owned, and she, in a small town, most small town papers are what they call consensus-oriented papers. That is, they don't cause controversy. They go to a city council meeting. They do not report on the debate and the arguments in the city council meeting. They debate. They write stories about what they decided as a group, but they don't tell you that they had a big argument in the middle of their meeting. They don't. That's not a consensus-oriented story. There have been scientific studies of why is this that weekly newspapers, typically of small communities, are consensus-oriented versus what they would call conflict-oriented in a big city. Big city dailies are always conflict-oriented. They report the conflicts. It's more interesting. And so I was actually kind of caught in that trap. I come from a big city newspaper, and now was going to a small community, my first one I bought, and I was ruffling feathers because I was telling the truth, because I was actually covering the controversies. And so in this case, actually a friend of my family, it was my hometown newspaper I bought, and a friend of the family was the chairman of the school board that was running all the schools. And she decided to resign because it was a thankless job. People hated her. They were always complaining. So she decided to quit her office as chairman of the school board. But then when I quoted her, she was embarrassed. And so she denied that she said those things. So I said, because she was a family friend, I said, okay, you said I'm sure I'm accurate, but if you're saying I'm not, you write the story yourself, and I'll print it in the next paper. We'll put your version in. And so she wrote her own version of the story. I put it in the newspaper, and it sounded just like mine. And to such a degree that then the rumor started going around town that I'd made up the second story and said it was hers, but it was really mine, which wasn't true. My receptionist actually typed it right out of the envelope, so she knew that it wasn't my writing. So it's usually somebody who's been embarrassed, and they claim that you misquoted them, not because you misquoted them, but because they're embarrassed about what you quoted, especially if it's accurate. But other than those 4 cases I can remember, 3 of which I had recordings for, nobody's ever said I was inaccurate, and it's very, very clear what their incentive was. So, for me, I like to use recorders for that reason. I've done well by them. And another reason why I use them is, especially if I'm doing a telephone interview, I can hook up, there's ways of hooking up your recorder to a telephone. And then if somebody hangs up on you, if they don't want to talk to you, even though they hang up on you and say no comment, the first thing they'll say is no comment. And then they'll start commenting. And so even those who say no comment will follow up their no comment with a comment. And if you have even 20 seconds of somebody's comment as they're saying no comment, it makes a good story. So 20 seconds of a comment in the middle of saying they're not going to comment is a good thing to have. And it actually makes, 20 seconds can be 2 or 3 sentences of a quote. So I run it for that sort of a reason, in case somebody doesn't want to talk to me, and they do talk to me to tell me they don't want to talk to me. I get some good quotes out of it. But if I use a recorder, typically I'm also going to take notes. Partly because in taking the notes, I'm basically establishing a table of contents for my recorder. I never want to transcribe the entire interview. I only want to transcribe key parts of it that I didn't have adequate notes on. And so if I've taken notes at the same time that I've done a recording, first off, if the recording doesn't work for some reason, somehow destroyed, or there's too much background noise, or for some reason I can't transcribe it, I have notes to write my story. That's a good thing to do. But on the other hand, you have a table of contents in which to go back to your recording and only transcribe, maybe out of an hour interview, transcribe no more than 5 minutes of it, because you wouldn't want to transcribe more than that anyway. So you find the most important few minutes of your recording, transcribe that in order to have the complete quotes and everything. But that's all you're going to transcribe from your entire recording. Yeah, so that's an option for you if you want to make sure that you're accurate and get good quotes. One of the award-winning journalists that I interviewed for my textbook was a New York Times reporter, and he would actually never take notes. His area was crime, and so he actually put people in prison with his stories. One of the stories he told me about was he got the evidence he needed to basically put a union boss, the president of a union, into prison for misusing union funds. I won't go into, when we start talking about reporting, which is chapter 3 of the textbook, I'll go into the technique he used. But what's pertinent to this is that he was afraid that if he took any notes even, let alone a recorder, that the person wouldn't talk to him. And so he kept eye contact, didn't write a single note while he was talking to the person. And then as soon as the interview was over, he'd run out and maybe sit in the stairwell or someplace as quick as he could and write his notes from memory. Even if you are taking notes, you might want to use that technique, is go ahead and as soon as possible sit down, and while it's still fresh in your memory, your notes are not perfect. Therefore, if you read through your notes and you still have memory of what they said, more or less, you can write some more notes down as you remind yourself by your notes, put more information into your notes from your memory. So it's a good thing to take some time after you've interviewed somebody and taken notes to sit down and add to your notes while it's fresh in your mind. However, that said, I've had a lot of stories where in fact, I told you, 2 mayors got kicked out of office, and I was running a tape recorder sitting right in front of them. They did not, once I started the recorder, once I did make eye contact to them, I did make it as controversial or as conversational as possible, and they spilled the beans anyway. Partly because they're so arrogant that they didn't think that I could hurt them by what they told me, or that maybe they thought I was their friend and not a journalist, but I was a journalist. I'm a quasi-friend. I'm a make-believe friend. I try to make them think I'm a friend. But when it comes to my job, if they say something controversial, I'm going to quote them, because I'm not truly their friend. So as I was mentioning the other day, that's the problem of assigning a beat to a reporter and never taking him off that beat, is becomes friends with the police officers, friends to whoever's on their beat, and then they are hesitant to write a story about them when it's negative, because they'll hurt their friendship. So beats can sometimes be counterproductive if you leave somebody in that beat too long and they become too friendly. Then they're afraid to write a controversial or a negative story. So I've had lots of opportunities to get people to say really stupid stuff, and I've had a recorder running, and it didn't stop them from saying stupid stuff. So I think the New York Times reporter, well, maybe if you're putting somebody in prison and that person's not a total idiot, then maybe he's right. Maybe you can't do a recording of that. But you'd be very, very surprised at what people will say with the recorder running. And more so if you're keeping eye contact with them and still making them feel like they're in a conversation and they forget about the recorder. So you do want to take some notes, but if it's a real controversial one, if you know that they might freeze up if you're taking notes, then you do depend on your recorder. You turn on that recorder, you put it in front of them, and then you look at them in the eyes, you converse with them, and you get them to forget about the recorder. And they will. In every case I've ever done it, they have forgotten about the recorder very quickly. So you may want to use a recorder, what you're doing. We will typically, I would still suggest you use the inverted pyramid. This will be in your quiz, by the way. We talked about this in other courses that you may have taken from me. It was I can't remember his first name, but an academic writer named Huff was his last name. I remember that. Is a person who came up with the idea of a complete lead. Most journalists, even today, do not use this theory, but I think it's best practices, and I'm still going to promote Huff's perspective on this because it has really helped my journalism. The idea of the inverted pyramid using the old style, the non-Huff style, is that you have the essence of the 5 W's in your first paragraph. But if you put the essence of the 5 W's in one paragraph, you're going to have a paragraph that's 55 words long or so. And if it's one sentence, which is also what the norm is for the industry, is just one sentence, and it's 55 words long, I can guarantee it's going to be a confusing sentence. You can't write a 55-word sentence and have it not be fairly complex. So Huff came along and said, hey, we don't need to do it that way. Let's make the lead, the complete lead, be 2 paragraphs or even 3 paragraphs if you need them. So the first paragraph is to grab their attention. The first paragraph can be 15 words because it's only going to emphasize the most interesting thing of your story. And so it's not going to cover all 5 W's. It might cover 1 W, maybe 2 W's. But it's not going to try to cover all 5 W's in the lead. You're going to keep it down short, maximum 35 words. But very possibly, I'd say most of my leads are 15 or 20 words because I'm only emphasizing in the lead the most interesting aspect. And then in paragraph 2, I finish the 5 W's, the essence of the 5 W's that are important for the reader to know. So you do provide, inverted pyramid does suggest you provide a summary of the story in the first couple, in at least the complete lead by Huff's version of it. And then you make a transition to the body of your story using creating a bridge. And so you have to make a smooth transition from your summary to the detailed body of the story. Those of you who took the history course from me have heard me say, if you remember, I don't know, but basically I suggest, and what I do in my own practice, is one way I come up with the lead is I look through my notes and find the most interesting direct quote. And then I don't use the direct quote as the lead. In fact, let me emphasize that at least in Western journalism, a direct quote is like 1 in 1,000 stories. And if you're young using a direct quote lead, they're going to immediately say, amateur, 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 if you use a direct quote lead. So I cannot recommend a direct quote lead. Even if it's a good direct quote, you'll still be pegged an amateur if you're young. Same thing with a question lead, by the way. A question lead is 1 in 10,000 stories, probably in the West. Sometimes an older journalist may use a question lead, but you don't want to use it as a beginner because they'll peg you as an amateur if you use a question lead. So again, I go look at my direct quotes, and I do not use a direct quote lead. I almost never use a direct quote lead, but I take my best direct quote, and I then create an indirect quote out of it. That's my lead, and then the direct quote is my paragraph 3. So I use an indirect quote for my lead. I finish the 5 W's in my second paragraph. The third paragraph is the direct quote that gives some more detail, gives some emotion, gives some other elements that are interesting in a direct quote. That becomes my paragraph 3. So I recommend that as a quick way, a very quick way of if you have good direct quotes, it's a quick way to get going in your story. Find your best direct quote, that represents the essence of the story, obviously. Summarize it in an indirect quote for your lead. Summarize the other 5 W's in paragraph 2, and go back to your direct quote as paragraph 3, and you have a good share of your story already done with those 3 paragraphs. So it's I think, as I've explained some other place, I have more of a mathematical mind than I have an artistic mind, and so I take a very logical approach to the way I write myself, and I can write stories very quickly by using my formula. Okay, so that's all we have in that. That's 12 pages, and I've covered the most important parts already for your quiz on Friday. But that doesn't mean you wouldn't benefit by reading it yourselves. Let me see, what else? We're going to run out of time here. I can see that for some reason I am running out of battery. I need to get plugged in here. Okay, I need to get to your assignments. Let me go back to the PowerPoint, and that may be why I did not go to the presentation mode before. Let me see. Okay, I will go back to it now and move forward. Oh yeah, so this again, this is in the PowerPoint. I reviewed this yesterday, but this is how to sign up. It is will be on Moodle but if you're not signed up to Moodle, you can't find it. But you do need this password, NE 2018, to register yourself in the Moodle version of our course. So remember that. Okay, let me first go back to the syllabus itself. This kind of summarizes it, but let me go back to the syllabus real quickly. Or go to the syllabus, not back to it, because I haven't done that yet today. Let me first go to how the grading for this course will be done. So right here, I did not create this course syllabus, but once the course syllabus is created, an instructor cannot change it. Cannot change certain aspects of it. I can change the detail of what we study or how we study it in class, but for example, I cannot change that 50% of this course grade will come from a final exam. I would. I don't think it should. I don't think 50% of a course grade should come from a final exam. But that's the one thing I cannot change in this course. So the other, get this out of the way here. The first 50% will be from your coursework. I mentioned there will be 10. I think I may have said 15 before, but then when I got into it, I changed my mind. In order to make it add up to 100% properly and to keep that 50%. I wanted to make it 40%. Some other courses are 40% final exam. This is the most for a final exam of any course I've seen, and it should not be that high, but it is. So there will be 10 either weekly quizzes or minor projects, which will be worth only 1%. So altogether, they're worth 10% of your grade. So this Friday, for example, you will have a quiz based on my lecture, more specifically on Chapter 1 of the crash course, which is on Moodle. So you should get signed up for Moodle. It'll be worth 1% only. The next week, you will have a minor project, and that will be coming up with 3 story ideas, and I'll go more specifically into that project in a second. That will also be worth only 1% of your overall grade. But it will help you prepare to write your story. The quiz will help you with your final exam, by the way. Almost all the, well, let me jump down here a second. Section A of your final exam will be objective questions, and I can tell you that almost all of them will come from your quizzes. So you may have, actually I haven't even decided yet, so you might have 6 quizzes during the semester. But they're only going to be worth 1 point. Then you may have 4 minor projects also worth 1 point to add up to 10% of your overall grade. However, your final, this section A, also worth 10%, those questions may come directly from your 1% quizzes. So one thing you should do is that when you should do the quiz, even if you haven't studied for it, even if you think you're going to bomb it, anything's better than a 0 anyway. Take the quiz and do a screen capture of all the questions so that you can study the questions for the final exam. Okay, I in my class I taught in fall semester, one of my smartest students did not do that. He was one of the last ones out of the exam, but I could tell he had not copied the questions, because all the questions came from the quizzes, and he sat there. Most people were done in 30 minutes because they studied the questions, and he was still there after 2 hours and didn't do well. Well, I actually felt bad about that because I knew he was smart, very smart. So I want it to be fair to everybody. Copy the questions because you're going to see them again in the final exam. I may change them slightly, however. So a question that might say, which of the following is the correct answer, I might change it to be, which of the following is the incorrect answer. And I might change the answer slightly. The question would essentially be the same, but I would change it some way so that make sure that you understand the question and that you're not just memorizing answers. Because you might, like teams sometimes come up with the answers or something, and you didn't really understand the question, you just memorized answers. You'll get penalized for that by the fact that I will change some of the questions slightly. And so if all you've done is memorize answers, you're going to look like an idiot when I've changed the question slightly. So be sure to understand the question and understand why the correct answer is the correct answer. And then what will happen if I change it slightly, you will still hopefully be able to come up with the right answer. So the 1% quizzes are important for you to take and to copy, to study later on. You will also, each of you, do a presentation. Let me get that going around right now. The presentation sheet here I'm going to pass around. You don't have to sign up today, but 2 of the easiest ones can be done next week. One would be chapter 4 of this textbook, and it's about macro editing. It's basically some of the stuff I already talked about, is what a content editor would be thinking about. The importance of the story, how to look at a story from the audience perspective, things like that. So chapter 4 of this is one of the easier chapters if somebody wanted to take it on next week. If you don't, I will talk about it myself. Another one would be, next week would be chapter 3 of my crash course. Chapter 3 is about reporting. It's shorter than that textbook, chapter 4, and it's purely about the techniques of good reporting. We'll talk about it. Whatever you don't cover, I will cover. By the way, you're unlike in the past, even though you're covering an entire chapter, in some cases the chapters may be a little bit longer, you're restricted to presenting no more than 15 minutes, which means there's no possible way to cover an entire long chapter. I don't want you to. It gets boring, and I'm there to tell the rest of the story. So whatever you don't cover, I will cover. So you don't need to cover the whole thing. Your job is to cover what you feel is the most important part of your assignment. By the way, some of them are not chapters at all. Somewhere in here are videos, like a series of 4 or 5 15-minute videos about how to use Quark Express. Your assignment with that would be to come up here and demonstrate what you learned out of those 4 or 5 videos about Quark, and it'd be a demonstration of the key principles you learned from that hour and 20-minute worth of video. So that's, in that case, you don't have any reading to do, but you have to understand what they're demonstrating to you, because you're going to re-demonstrate it, at least the key points, to the class. So that's one of the options also. So again, some people for some reason got off, and they sometimes 2 people in my first tutorial. In some of these cases, 2 people assigned. No, only 1 person per topic, not 2. And again, you're only talking for 15 minutes at the maximum. You start getting penalized after 15 minutes. So I do not want you to cover everything in that chapter or in those videos or whatever. I want you to cover the most important. That will be part of your grade, that you chose what I feel are the most important things. So that doesn't mean you can be lazy and cover the first page and think you're done. Because if you cover the first page, that's almost certainly not going to be the most important part of the chapter. So you do have to take some time and go through your chapter, go through your material, and consider what is the most important information to share with the class. So, yeah, do that. Okay, so I will start this around. Again, only 1 presenter per topic. There should be enough topics for everybody to take one. I should have done that sooner because we're going to run out of time here, but there it goes. Okay, going back to the syllabus. Anyway, your presentation is only worth 4%, so even if you do a bad job, it's not going to kill you. But restrict yourself to 15 minutes or you start getting penalized. Do as good a job as you can, but it's 4% of your grade. Other than the final, your biggest part are 4 major projects, and I already kind of referred to them. Your first project that will be due in week 4 is your story. So this week you should start thinking about your story. Next week, by the end of next week, you hand me your story ideas, 3 story ideas, even though you're going to write 1. You're only going to write 1 story, but give me 3 story ideas, and I'll go through the information you need to give me in a second. It's not 1 sentence, it's more than that. But you're going to give me 3 story ideas with some detail for the end of next week. And then by week 4, you're going to give me your complete story. So you have 4 weeks to produce a new story, and that will be worth 9 points. We have 4 major projects, each worth 9 points, adding up to 36 points altogether. Major project 1 is your news story. As I said, it needs to be accurate. It's going to be published. It's going to be read by other people. Project 2, we will take some of those news stories and we'll create a magazine out of them. So project 2 will be using Quark Express. We'll have learned that by then. So sometime around the midterm, you will finish major project 2, which will be your magazine layout and design in electronic format using Quark Express. Major project 3 is your tabloid. I already mentioned these. Your tabloid will be 2 pages. So you'll be doing 2 tabloid pages for that project. You can jump some stories from page 1 to page 2, from your page 1 or page 2. They may not end up being page 1 and page 2 of our final version, but from your page 1 to page 2, you can jump. I do, with that one, want you to fill up the entire page 2 with that 3rd project. With the 4th project, it will be broadsheet, which is the broadsheet is twice the size of tabloid. You will complete 1 complete page, but I still want to see that you know how to jump a story properly. And so you will jump at least 1 story to page 2, and more if you need to. But page 2 and with the broadsheet will be just for jumps. And then we will, when we put together the full publication, we'll put more than just your jumps on a page. We'll put somebody else's jumps on a page and tie them together, continued on page, whatever page it will be. So that's the essence of your major projects, 3 desktop publishing projects, and the 1 writing project, worth 36% of your grade. So, and then we have your final exam. Your section B of your final exam will be to do a tabloid page using Quark Express. Your grade will not just be, by the way, that you know how to use Quark. It will also be, do you know how to headline properly your stories? Do you know how to put them on the page in a pleasing way? Do you use your art properly? By the way, with your stories, again, part of your grade with your stories will be your art. That's one of the things you're supposed to figure out what to do, is how do we get some good photographs or other art for the story? Because we need them to do a good job with our publication. Okay, so any questions on that? Let me jump back to the PowerPoint. And here I have some more explanation of the first minor project, the 1% minor project due at the end of next week. And so this is basically an example. Well, first off, this is basically describing what you need to include. You need to include 3 story ideas. You need to include sources, not necessarily by name. If you have names, that's fine. But at least what sort of people are you going to interview for this story? You need multiple sources. At least, I would recommend at least 3 sources. Even if it's I think an example I gave was a story about more or less a profile of a professor. That's one source. Talk to the professor. But then to get 3 sources, you may also talk to his chairman. You may talk to 1 or 2 students to get 3 or 4 sources. So you need more than one source, even if it's a profile story, which is a fairly easy story to write. Probably won't get you as many points as something a little more complicated, a little more difficult than that. But it's but maybe you will, because somebody who does a more complicated story may do a bad job. And you can do a good job with a profile story where you have most of the content will be an interview with the person you're profiling, and then you get quotes from chairman and a student or 2 students or something, and make a good story out of it. Profile story is easy to write, but if you do a good job, you can still get an A. If somebody else does something more complicated, well, then they will get a high A, I guess. Okay, so you're going to tell me your sources, at least in general. You're going to suggest which news values make this each of those stories an important story to Xiamen students. So one of them that hopefully will be included in all of your stories will be consequence. Maybe not. Maybe they're a feature story. Well, one I just mentioned, a profile story. Is there any consequence to a profile story? Maybe. If you can make a case that professor is really helping the university gain higher credibility, a greater, in helping its brand, then maybe there's consequence to it. But there are some stories, feature-type stories, that would not have a lot of consequence. But there might be some consequence even in those. But you may have something else. You may have some suspense. You may have something else to throw in as a news value. The next element is your photos or other graphics. What photos or other graphics can you get to put into your story? As I said, all of you should have some graphics planned for your story. You may even choose a story partly because it has good photo opportunities. A good story with good photos is more likely to be at the top of the page, of a page that somebody's laying out, because you have good photos. Also, if you don't have something exceptional, let me cover photos real quick. Everybody needs to listen to this. I hate photos of people smiling at a camera. As an editor, I absolutely hate them. So if you want to get a bad grade, give me photos with people smiling at the camera. Okay? I don't like them. Though I don't like pose. Well, sometimes you can pose a photo that is not, doesn't look too posed. Let me put it that way. When I would go start a new newspaper, the first thing I would do would be to go to all the meetings of important public officials, and I would sit there and snap about 50 photos during that meeting. The public officials would be looking at me like, what is this guy doing? But those photos then would go into my folder to be used anytime I wanted to. So it was important for me to have a bunch of photos that have different expressions. None of them would be posed. So they'd be city councilmen arguing with each other. So someone would have maybe a serious look in their face. Some case might not be doing anything other than just thinking. But you get a good pose by somebody thinking real hard about what's going on. None of them were posed because I didn't want posed pictures. I wanted real pictures in a real meeting expressing different moods or emotions or whatever. And so I filled up my electronic folders with photos of those public officials that I could use multiple times if I needed to. Obviously if I went back to city council meeting, I would take more photos probably. But I always had that stockpile from that very first week of being there. I would stockpile photos of every important public official that I could get my hands on. None of them posed. If you are going to stage a photo, you still don't want it to look staged. So, for example, if you are interviewing a professor, it might be in his classroom. Maybe you go in there while he's actually teaching class. You might take a photo of him at his desk talking to you. Because we're sharing offices, maybe you don't take very many photos inside his office, but you take some there, mostly just to get some photos, but you try to get him not to look at the camera. Or if he's looking at the camera, not get him when he's talking to you. Ask him a question, then start taking pictures while he's answering. Don't let him stop and smile. So ask him a question, start taking pictures. You might, if the most posed of the photos might be take him outside with a good background. Maybe he's standing by the lake, shooting across to the new buildings or something, or some other, something with an interesting background to it. And then ask him some questions and start taking photos. You still don't want him smiling at the camera, but now you might turn a fairly mundane photo into a top of the page photo by the fact that it has some interesting background to it. So yes, you can think of the background and how you can enhance your photo with the background. It could be, again, the classroom photo. It could be, standing by the lake photo, but don't get them smiling at the camera. I don't like that. It's bad journalism. It's not photojournalism to stare at the camera. So try to think how you can get their picture without having them staring at the camera. The last thing that you're going to put in your three proposals is some of the key questions. They don't have to be exactly the way you would phrase them, but they should be, the idea of what you're going to ask them would be in the questions as you put them to me. Let me go through some examples. So here's example one. This link here is to a New York Times story that just came out yesterday. And the New York Times basically says that the Chinese leaders should be worried about the summit talks between North Korea and South Korea and the United States with U.S. President Trump. Because a good percentage of as I mentioned earlier, a good percentage of our students are from China. A good percentage of our lecturers and professors are from China. A story about China is relevant, or could be. In this case, they're saying this is a bad thing for China, that America might make friends with North Korea. So in this example, you could interview Dr. Wang in our department. There are some professors in economics, but they don't all have to be Chinese. yes, they would have a direct, but other people from Southeast Asia would also give their perspective. Is it a bad thing that America makes friends with North Korea? Basically, it's part of one of your basic questions. You can also ask students if they have an opinion on whether, on this. You might even quote a segment of the New York Times. The New York Times thinks it's a bad thing for China. They should worry about this. Well, maybe you challenge that. Maybe the professor says, no, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Maybe we can avoid nuclear war here. So the news value would be consequence. The New York Times says the Chinese leaders should be concerned about losing power. Therefore, the upcoming summit could directly impact Chinese students and professors because China loses power somehow. Photos and graphics, original photos of Xiamen interviewees and uncopyrighted internet photos of the presidents involved in this from North Korea, South Korea, China, and America. Questions might be, how would diminishing the stressful discord between North and South Korea and the USA be detrimental to China? That could be a question you'd ask a professor, for example. Other questions would be, why might it be difficult for Xiamen to... Oops, that's the wrong story. I went too far. Okay, other question would be, why should North Korea diminishing its reliance on China for trade and security be of significant negative consequence to Chinese leaders and citizens? Another question might be, why will China's exclusion from the talks significantly undermine its prestige and make it, quoted from the story, irrelevant in the region? Again, another one, how might it be beneficial for the USA, out of respect, to include China in the talks? Bring them in. Maybe that'd be better for the USA to do that. Another question would be, how could a denuclearized North Korea be beneficial to China? Is there a benefit in that? So, anyway, you come up with some of the key questions that you want to ask. You may ask them in more than one question when you're actually in the interview. You might pursue and get them talking, and as you're asking questions, come up with other questions to ask them. So these aren't the only questions you're going to ask, but I want you to give me some of the key questions that you would ask with your story, not my story, with your story. Okay, this is an example of a story that I pulled out of the New York Times. Okay, so again, you can start with the idea that comes from someplace else, but then you're localizing it. You're making it relevant to our students by asking your questions and finding sources locally. The other example is more of doesn't have a source from another publication. It's right here on campus. Again, this is just my example. I'm not asking you to copy this. I'm asking you to think, or I want you to understand what I'm expecting you to give me. I want you to give me 3 story ideas with this sort of information in them. Okay, so this one is, why might it be difficult for Xiamen to recruit and keep Western professors? And how do they benefit Xiamen? There are, well, let me say, I guess one of the Western professors has announced that she's going to leave Xiamen. For a variety of reasons, not necessarily because she hates her job. There are elements that she doesn't like about it. One element that most Western professors would not like about Xiamen is we have too much paperwork that does not exist at other universities that most of us have experienced. This is, to a large degree, not Xiamen's fault. It's the Ministry of Education's fault. In fact, we just met with somebody who was evaluating our program the other day, and she admitted to us, we're having to build big folders of like hundreds of pages documenting what we taught in our classes. And she said in the government universities, they don't have to do that. The notes they put together from their class is like 1/10 of what we're putting together to please the Ministry of Education, because we're a private university. So they're penalizing us for being a private university. But nonetheless, it impacts all the professors. And so in the West, they don't have to do that stuff. In Kazakhstan, I didn't have to do that stuff. I didn't like the paperwork Kazakhstan made me do, and that was nothing compared to what I have to do here. It makes me appreciate how little they asked me to do there. And yet I still ignored them sometimes and didn't do it. So That's one of the problems. Is another related to it is they're micromanaging our classes to the degree that in America it would violate what we call academic freedom of professors. Professors get to decide, make a lot more decisions in America. So anyway, that would be the sort of stuff I would be thinking about if I did this story. So some of the Western professors here you could interview are here. You could talk to an administrator, to students. Again, this is my story idea, not yours. Original photos of the interviewees, obviously. News value is certainly consequence. Having an international faculty, including Western professors, might help raise Xiamen's prestige and credibility, might enhance students' education by offering another important perspective, and might open new employment opportunities for Xiamen graduates by your networking with Western professors. A lot of my students from Kazakhstan have gone to America and been helped by my letters of recommendation, for example. So key questions might be, how do Western faculty members at Xiamen impact the university's instruction and its brand? How is working at Xiamen different than working at a U.S. university? What challenges do Western professors encounter at Xiamen? Why might some Western professors not want to tolerate such challenges? So those are examples of two stories that I might write. Okay? I want you to do this with 3 stories. This took me, a couple of hours coming up, looking quickly at New York Times, finding a story about China, coming up with some, thought of something that I thought was an issue here at the university, and it took me long enough to just type this up. So this is not due until the end of next week, but it's an important first step in preparing to write your story. That you need to be thinking, one of these 3 is, at least presumably, going to be the story you actually finish. And so now you're thinking about its importance, what news values it has, who you're going to talk to, what photos you can take, what questions you're going to ask. So again, you're going to do it for 3 stories. I just did it for 2. And you're just going to choose one of them ultimately. And I may give you some feedback. You hand this in next week. I'll try to give you some quick feedback. I won't be able to spend a lot of time because there's nearly 100 students in our class. But I'll try to go through real quick and give you, a sentence or 2 of feedback. Maybe tell you which one I think is best, something like that, very quickly. So, any questions on your assignments? So this Friday, you have a quiz. You can take it any time from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Moodle. I don't know how long it will be because I don't know what questions I'm going to ask. But as I said, a multiple choice question I won't give you more than 1 minute for it. I know that. And a true and false question, I probably won't give you more than 30 seconds for that. So it's not like you can just open it up and then look for the answers. You won't have time to do that. You better become familiar with Chapter 1 of the crash course, especially. Hopefully you've paid attention in my lectures here today and yesterday. And so you'll have, probably most of the questions, I'm not promising, but probably most of them will come from Chapter 1 of the crash course. That we covered in some detail between the 2 lectures, and you can actually look at it, 12 pages from the crash course by Friday. Okay, any questions? Seems like there's one other thing I was going to mention. I don't remember what it was. I know it was. Today I've taken the whole time for lecture. This is not a lecture portion of our class, but I felt like I needed to cover this. I didn't get it done yesterday. There will be times when I give mostly lecture. That will usually, though, like when we start learning Quark, I'll have to give demonstrations of how to do things. So the first day we start on Quark, I will probably take the whole session to go through Quark, show you the basics. Maybe even write in class, give you your minor project you might be able to complete in class Or am I saying, okay, now do this, now do this, now do this, now do that, and it's worth 1% of the grade, that you're paying attention and keeping up with me. Or I might show you how to do something and then give you a separate one and expect you to come back into the lab later on your own and complete the minor project. But as I said, mostly this is for actually doing something in here. But there will be times when I need to do some lectures, and today I felt like I needed to just get you started. The syllabus has been uploaded also to Moodle, but after week 1, it's all from an old version. It's not the current version. So I will let you know as I proceed. As you have, those of you who have taken classes from me before know that very frequently I make changes in the syllabus as we go along, and that's no exception here. I've never taught this class using Quark Express. Actually, when I taught this class a year ago, I wasn't even here when the class started. I was still in Kazakhstan. So Shiogi started the class. He taught it for 5 weeks, and I took over in week 5 or 6 or whatever week it was. So I wasn't even here when it started. So I didn't get to form it the way I wanted to. I didn't get to teach the first few weeks. So this one is, I did make changes as I took over the class, but we also had no desktop publishing system. I found a free desktop publishing system that's not nearly as good as Quark, and we did learn some desktop publishing last year, but it was with a free system that slow, not as good, but it was something. And I had to learn that from scratch because I'd never even seen it before, let alone use it professionally. So we're out of time. If those want to stay and fill out and write, sign up in the presentations, you can do that, or you can wait till next time. I'll pass it again. Next time, obviously, if anybody wants to present next week, you should have signed up tonight, so you can do that. And you may have questions for me on that if you're going to present next week. By the way, your presentation will be in the tutorial, not in the main lecture. It'll be in here. So you will only be lecturing to people in this class, and that's one reason why it's 15 minutes maximum. We don't want to take all this class time to have long lectures. So you can't have long lectures, and I need to have shorter lectures. Okay? Again, I'll stay around if anybody has any questions now or individually. I'll be here as long as I need to be here. Thank you.